I should have listened when the old woman grabbed my wrist at the village market, her fingers cold as tombstone. She leaned close enough that I could smell decay on her breath, and whispered that the night woman walks these hills when the moon hides its face. I laughed it off, told her I didn't believe in local superstitions, that I was just here to photograph the abandoned monastery for my travel blog. The way her milky eyes widened told me I'd made a terrible mistake. The guest house owner refused to meet my gaze when I checked in that evening. He pushed the key across the wooden counter like it burned his palm and muttered something in the local dialect I couldn't understand. When I asked him to repeat it in English, he just shook his head and disappeared into the back room, leaving me standing alone in the lobby with my backpack and camera gear. The silence felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums like I descended too deep underwater. My room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a hallway that seemed to stretch longer than the building's exterior suggested. The floorboards creaked with each step, and I noticed that every other door had small bundles of dried herbs nailed above the frame. My door had nothing, just naked wood and peeling paint that looked like diseased skin. I made a mental note to ask about it in the morning, thinking it might make interesting content for my followers. That first night, I woke to the sound of humming. It was a lullaby, sweet and sad, coming from somewhere inside the room. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I could make out the basic shapes of furniture. The window with its thin curtains, the chair where I'd draped my jacket. Nothing seemed out of place, but the humming continued, circling the room like it was searching for something. I told myself it was wind in the pipes, old building acoustics, anything rational my mind could grasp. Then I saw her feet, spare, pale feet standing beside my bed, toes pointed at an unnatural angle like broken stems. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe as my eyes traveled upward to the hem of a white dress that seemed to absorb the darkness around it. My gaze kept climbing against my will, past thin hands with too many fingers, past a throat that pulsed with something that wasn't a heartbeat. I squeezed my eyes shut before I could see her face, every instinct screaming that looking would break something inside me I could never repair. The humming stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse, filled with expectation and hunger. I felt breath on my face, cold enough to hurt, carrying that same smell of rot from the old woman's warning. Something touched my forehead, a finger tracing a symbol I couldn't see but could feel burning into my skin. Then the weight in the air lifted, and when I finally opened my eyes again, dawn was bleeding through the curtains, and I was alone. I checked out immediately, not bothering to pack properly, just shoving everything into my bag with shaking hands. The owner was waiting at the desk like he'd known I'd run. Didn't ask why I was leaving early, or offer a refund. Took the key and said in perfect English this time that I should go to the monastery today, in daylight, and speak to Brother Thomas. When I asked why, he finally met my eyes and I saw something there that looked like pity. He said the night woman only marks people she intends to keep. The walk to the monastery took 40 minutes up a steep trail that wound through dead trees. No birds sang here, no insects buzzed, just my footsteps and ragged breathing breaking the oppressive quiet. The building itself was smaller than I'd expected from the photos online, its stone walls covered in moss and climbing vines that looked more like veins. The front door stood open, an invitation or a warning, I couldn't tell which. Brother Thomas was sweeping the chapel when I entered, though there was no dirt on the floor. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of haunted eyes you see in war veterans. He stopped mid-sweep when he saw me, and his face went pale. Before I could say anything, he asked if I'd been marked, a teen. When I touched my forehead where I could still feel the burning, his shoulders sagged in defeat. He led me to a small room off the chapel where the walls were covered in photographs. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, of different people, different eras, judging by the clothing and photo quality, but they all had one thing in common. They were standing beside their beds, and behind each one, barely visible, was a pale figure in white. My blood turned to ice when I recognized the guest house room in several photos, the same peeling wallpaper, the same window. Brother Thomas said these were the ones who didn't listen, the ones who thought they could leave. I demanded to know what she wanted, this night woman, why she was doing this. Brother Thomas set down his broom and told me a story that sounded like madness, but felt like truth. 300 years ago, there was a woman in the village who lost her child to fever. In her grief, she made a bargain with something old, something that lived in the spaces between sleep and waking. She would take other children to replace the one she'd lost, stealing them from their beds in the darkest hours. The villagers eventually caught her and burned her alive, but the thing she'd bargained with didn't release her from their deal. Now she walks every moonless night, still searching for the child she can never find. The mark she gives isn't random, Brother Thomas explained. She chooses people who remind her of what she's lost, some quality or essence only she can perceive. Once marked, you have 3 nights to break the binding, or you become part of her collection, trapped in that space between sleep and waking, standing forever beside beds and photographs no one should be able to take. I asked him how to break it, trying to keep the panic from my voice. He looked at me for a long moment before walking to a cabinet and pulling out an old leather journal. The pages were filled with desperate handwriting in multiple languages, counts from others who'd been marked, various attempts at breaking free. Most entries ended mid-sentence, unfinished, the writers presumably claimed. But there was one method that appeared multiple times, always underlined, always written in shaking script. You had to go to where she died and offer her something precious, something that represented your own grief or loss. The problem was that no one knew exactly where she'd been burned. The village had moved locations twice since then, and the old site was somewhere in the woods beyond the monastery. Brother Thomas had searched for years and found 3 possible locations, all of them marked by unusual formations of stones and dead earth where nothing would grow. I would have to choose correctly and make my offering before the 3rd night, which according to his calculations was tomorrow. He gave me the journal and a hand-drawn map with the 3 sites marked. I turned to leave. He grabbed my arm with surprising strength and told me one more thing. If I saw her face, truly saw it, and looked into her eyes, I would understand what she'd lost. Most people who did that stopped trying to break free, choosing instead to join her willingly. When I asked why, he said grief recognizes grief, and some sorrows are so deep they become their own kind of comfort. I spent the rest of the day hiking to the first site, a clearing where the trees grew in a perfect circle around scorched earth. I knelt there with the most precious thing I owned. It's my grandmother's ring. The last piece of her I had after cancer took her 2 years ago. I pressed it into the dirt and begged for release, promising anything, offering everything. Nothing happened. The forest remained silent, and when I dug up the ring, it was covered in beetles that swarmed up my hand, biting, leaving tiny marks that looked like burns. The second site was worse. It was a ravine where the map indicated there should be a stone altar. But all I found was a deep pool of stagnant water that reflected the sky wrong, showing stars even though it was still afternoon. I threw the ring in, watched it sink into darkness that seemed to have no bottom. I waited an hour, then 2, but the only thing that surfaced was a child's shoe, rotted and ancient, bobbing obscenely in the center of the pool. I left it there and ran. Back at the guest house that night because I had nowhere else to go, I barricaded my door and kept every light on. The owner had left herbs outside my room, those same bundles I'd seen on other doors, though we both knew they wouldn't help. I tried to stay awake, drinking bitter coffee and slapping my face when my eyelids drooped. But exhaustion is a patient hunter. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I lost the battle. The humming woke me, closer this time, intimate. Tamo. She was sitting on the edge of my bed, her weight making the mattress dip, her back to me. The white dress she wore was wedding silk, I realized, yellowed with age and stained with soot. Her hair hung long and black, moving slightly like it was underwater. I wanted to close my eyes again, to hide in the darkness behind my eyelids, but I found I couldn't. The mark on my forehead burned hotter, and I understood it was a hook, pulling my gaze where she wanted it. She turned slowly, and I caught glimpses that my mind refused to process completely. Lips that had been beautiful before the fire, hands that had cradled something precious before it was taken. And eyes, God help me, her eyes were still human, still filled with a mother's desperate love turned inside out and poisonous. She reached for me, and I felt her cold fingers on my cheek, gentle, almost loving. She whispered in a language I didn't know but somehow understood. "Have you seen my baby? Please, have you seen my baby?" The grief in her voice was a physical thing that pressed against my chest. I thought about my grandmother, about sitting beside her hospital bed, about how I'd have given anything for one more day, one more hour. I thought about how grief doesn't fade. It just becomes part of your architecture, a room you carry inside yourself that never gets smaller. And I understood what Brother Thomas meant, why people stopped fighting. It would be easier to stay, to exist in this twilight place where sorrow was shared, where I wouldn't be alone with my loss. I almost said yes. The word was forming on my lips when something vibrated in my pocket. My phone, somehow still charged, somehow getting a notification at 3 in the morning with no signal. I couldn't look away from her eyes, but I could feel it buzzing against my leg in a pattern that seemed familiar. I know. One long, two short, one long, like Morse code, like a heartbeat, like my grandmother's special knock she used to do on my bedroom door. The night woman's face, twisted, fury replacing sorrow for just a moment. That break in her expression let me tear my gaze away, and I lunged for the third site location on Brother Thomas's map. The one I'd been too scared to try because it was marked with a skull. She screamed, a sound that shattered the window and made my ears bleed, but I was already moving, crashing through the door, the herbs scattering, flying down the stairs as lights flickered and died behind me. The third site was in the monastery itself. Brother Thomas had known all along. The skull on the map wasn't a warning. It was a location marker for the crypt beneath the chapel. I found him waiting by the entrance, holding a candle. Manny didn't seem surprised to see me running through the darkness, with dawn still an hour away. Kai said he couldn't tell me directly, because I had to choose to come here, had to want it enough to figure it out myself. It's the thing about curses, he explained as we descended narrow stone steps, is they only work if part of you accepts them. The crypt was small, just a room with ancient coffins and walls carved with prayers in Latin. In the center was a burn mark on the floor, human-shaped arms spread wide. Brother Thomas said this was where they'd brought her body after, to bury her in blessed ground, hoping it would give her peace. It hadn't worked. He gave me a piece of chalk and told me to write my grief on the floor, to make it real and then let it go. I wrote about my grandmother, about how I wasn't there when she died because I was chasing photographs in another country, building a following, collecting likes instead of memories. I wrote about the guilt that lived in my throat, about the last voicemail she'd left that I'd been too busy to answer. I wrote until my hand cramped and tears made the chalk run. Cots, until the words became a circle around that burn mark, a binding of truth and regret. The night woman appeared in the corner, watching. Up close, in the candlelight, I could see the full horror of what she'd become, but also the tragedy. She was reaching for me when Brother Thomas began to pray. Old words in older Latin, and the chalk circles started to glow. She screamed again, but different this time. Not anger, but release, like a breath held for centuries, finally exhaling. The burning on my forehead stopped. A temperature in the crypt rose from freezing to merely cold. And the night woman began to fade, not disappearing but becoming transparent, her features softening back toward human. In that last moment, she looked at me and I saw understanding there, an acknowledgement that we'd both been marked by loss. Then she was gone, and the only sound was Brother Thomas's ragged breathing and my own. He told me I could leave now, that the binding was broken, Ataya, but he also said the mark never fully disappears, so that I'd always be able to sense her on moonless nights, feel her searching. Some people who survived became monks here, dedicating their lives to helping others who got marked. Others ran as far as they could and tried to forget. The choice was mine. I stayed for 3 days, helping Brother Thomas catalog the photographs, earning the prayers, understanding the weight of what I'd escaped. On the 4th morning I packed my bag and left, but I didn't go back to photographing hotels and posting aesthetic shots for strangers. I couldn't, not after seeing the space between sleep and waking, not after feeling what it meant to be truly haunted. Sometimes, when the moon hides its face, I still wake to humming. I still feel that cold breath on my face, still hear the whispered question about a lost child. But now I whisper back, telling her stories about my grandmother, about love and loss, and the way grief reshapes us, a teeny. And in those moments, the humming becomes almost peaceful, almost like forgiveness. The mark on my forehead only appears in photographs now, a faint symbol that no one else can see, but I see it every time I look at my reflection. A reminder that some warnings should be heeded, and some stories are written on our skin in invisible ink. The night woman marked me. But she also taught me that the spaces between sleep and waking hold truths we spend our lives avoiding. I never went back to that village, but Brother Thomas sends me letters sometimes. He tells me about new people who get marked, about the ones who make it and the ones who don't. He says the photographs on the wall keep multiplying, that the night woman's grief is an endless well. And he always ends each letter the same way, thanking me for listening, for choosing to fight, for proving that even the oldest curses can be broken by those brave enough to write their truth in chalk and tears.